Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, welcome here at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research to the second part in the context of the SIEGFRIED LANDSHUT Prize of the year 2019, which was awarded last Tuesday to Professor George Steinmetz. Today, we will have the privilege to listen to George's second Landshut lecture, which will have the title Concept Quake from the History of Science to the Historical Sociology of Social Science. It will certainly not turn out to be a mere addendum to the first brilliant lecture he gave in German about Soziologie und Kolonialismus, die Beziehung zwischen Wissen und Politik. But certainly, there will be at least some links and continuities between the two talks, and if it is only because of the fact that George Steinmetz is somebody who loves to think conceptually, who never shies away from historicizing theoretical concepts, and who therefore always has a close look at the development of his discipline, that is, sociology. As you can learn from the yellow sheets of papers distributed here, George Steinmetz, professor of sociology at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, the sociology department there is, by the way, currently #1 in the US, has had a great career which was made possible by an enormous list of publications. Since some of you have heard Teresa Coloma-Beck's laudatio of George Steinmetz 2 days ago, I don't dare to add anything to her praise. So just let me say that George Steinmetz embodies a rare mixture of talents and capabilities indeed. He is a great social theorist which is able to argue on the highest level of theoretical abstraction. He is at the same time one of the outstanding historical sociologists who doesn't hesitate to delve into the archives of different countries in order to find some odd details which might foster his more general arguments. And last but not least, he is probably the most interesting and innovative historian of the social sciences right now, who does not only more than anybody else to decolonize sociology, but whose knowledge about these different disciplinary fields is just breathtaking. So I'm sure we will have again a great intellectual pleasure and thus a great evening by listening to George and his arguments with respect to Begriffsbeben. George, it's your turn.
So thank you very much again for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation. This time I will speak in English. I will try to speak as distinctly and slowly as possible so that there won't be any problems understanding what I'm saying. If afterwards we do have a discussion, I would be more than willing to both receive questions, and I could even try to answer them in German if that would be better. But I will now speak in English. So the history of the sciences has slowly, over centuries, given rise to a history of social science. The rise of this meta-social scientific practice, however, was not the result of a smooth, continuous evolution, but of a series of concept shifts, or Begriffsbeben, as I call them, using Nietzsche's terminology and the uses and abuses of history. I will examine the ways in which social science has turned its sting against itself, to paraphrase Nietzsche again, when he argued that das Wissen muss seinen Stachel gegen sich selbst kehren. This lecture is a historical sociology, then, of the historical sociology of social science. I will address historical, theoretical, and meta-philosophical questions about this particular practice. First, I will try to ask, how did the history of social science emerge, and how has it been written? When did this peculiar practice emerge, and how has it been done? Second, how have historians of social science explained the genesis, the development, the forms, and the contents of their specialty? Third, what political, ethical, and meta-scientific goals have scholars pursued in doing this work? So there are these three questions that I'll try to keep in mind. And I will ask these three questions first about the history of the natural sciences, very briefly, and then turn to the history of the social sciences. And my conclusion, just to give you a kind of a fast forward, is that the history of the social science seems to me to be an essential part of any social science, including a social science of any object in the present, for reasons that I'll try to argue tonight. In the spirit of the so-called discontinuous vision of the development of science that was first proposed by the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard in his work starting in the 1930s and 20s even, I propose that we understand the emergence of the historical sociology of social science as the product of a series of 8 ruptures or concept quakes. Specifically, this path was marked by these 8 turning points. Can you see those from there? Okay. Specifically, it was marked by, first, the development of the history of sciences, and as historians of ancient science have shown, I'm by no means anything like that, but I've read their work, and they've shown the history of the science accompanied ancient science from the very beginning. Straightforward histories of the social sciences similarly accompanied the formation of the social sciences from the very beginning in the 18th and the 19th centuries, where they largely served the same purposes as the history of science, purposes such as legitimation. The second concept quake was the emergence of the histories of social science. This accompanied the rise of each of the modern sciences. The third break was introduced, I'll argue tonight, partly in the spirit of gesturing toward the Siegfried Landshut himself, but also because I genuinely believe this is the case, was introduced by Karl Marx. Some of Marx's ideas, not the ideas perhaps that are normally associated with his name, helped shape the breakthrough to a sociology of science and knowledge. The fourth rupture was the interwar sociology of knowledge, Wissenssoziologie, which developed almost entirely in Germany, and was the product of Scheler, Mannheim, and other well-known German sociologists. The fifth chapter was the emergence of contextualizing sociological accounts of the natural sciences. And this was the breakthrough that was made in the work of the Soviet historian Boris Hessen, the American sociologist Robert Merton, Ludwig Fleck, Edgar Zilsel, and others whom I'll have some words to say about tonight. The sixth moment was the rise in the late 1950s and in the 1960s of a contextualizing sociological analysis of social science. This began in the work of Georges Canguilhem, the French philosopher, his student Michel Foucault, the American sociologist Alvin Gouldner, the American historian George Stocking, and many, many others. These writers broke with earlier ideas in the history of science of inexorable progress. The idea that science was progressing inexorably was taken on by many of the social scientists to characterize their own work. It would inexorably move toward perfection. And they broke with those ideas and examined the impact on social science of factors both internal to science and external to science. The seventh moment consists of the rise of theories of epistemic reflexivity after Marx. Marx was not, he was definitely introducing some of the ideas about scientific reflexivity, but this became much more radicalized, I guess you could say, in the work of post-colonial theory, starting with Frantz Fanon and others, feminist standpoint theory, with people, just Sandra Harding standing in here for a real pioneer in that area, but among many others, critical race theory, queer theory, and intersectional analysis of race, class, gender, and other dimensions in the work of Dorothy Smith and Patricia Hill Collins and others. Finally, I will argue, and this is something I alluded to on Tuesday night, that sort of invisibly outside of France, I think, and maybe outside of my department at home where I talk about this all the time, Bourdieusian sociology, I think, has marked another conceptual rupture in this field, because it integrates a historical sociology of social science with a scientific reflexivity, bringing out the full potential of the history of social science by doing that. It combines theoretical analysis with intense, rigorous empirical work. And this kind of ethos is kind of, I think, a contingent, unique development that really needs to be signaled. So I'll try to do that. Okay, so now let me get to the talk. So as the historian of science, Lorraine Daston, argues, the historiography of science is an ancient pursuit that was born as part of the history of ancient mathematics, medicine, and other fields. This parallel history remained part of science through the 19th century, and it was mainly written by scientists themselves. Most of the historians of science were practicing scientists. Until well into the 20th century, this writing was triumphal and progressivist. It took the form of a grand narrative whose dramatis personae were the great scientific men of genius. The earliest historiography of science grew out of the study of technical and scientific inventors and discoverers. Aristotle's own idea was that the arts and the sciences gradually approximated to perfection. There was a shift then in the post-classical era from the study of who discovered what to the transmission of knowledge from one people or author to another. So this already marked a slightly more sociological approach, but this was still compatible with the idea of science as cumulative. This is a very, anyone who's a specialist in any of these areas will be cringing. I'm sorry, but I have to get to the present very quickly. The Enlightenment then strongly reaffirmed the idea of progress. Most of the Enlightenment thinkers who worked on science inscribed themselves into this tradition. One great example of this is Condorcet, whose Esquisse d'un tableau historique des progrès de l'esprit humain, sketch of a history of science of the human spirit, in 1795, describes historical progress as unilinear, incremental, dependent on steady accumulation and ordering of knowledge. And there are many, many other examples of this in the longer version of this paper. The writers argued the history of science should take no notice of mistakes in the history of science or dead ends. There was little room, therefore, for a properly historical account. The 19th century saw the emergence of histories of science distinct from properly scientific publications. So this was an important technical development in the field, if you want, that there were specific journals and publications dedicated to the history of science, finally. The narrative of science as progressing inevitably continued to dominate most of these works in France under the influence of Comtean positivism and in English Whig historiography. So let me turn then to another 19th century figure now, Karl Marx, who I think revolutionized or began to revolutionize this history. And he figures as an anchor in the development of the sociology of knowledge. Marx's thinking was divided, as those of you who knew Marx and read the Landshut volumes that were referred to yesterday, for example, or on Tuesday, that his vision was divided between one of science as progressing naturally, like this 2,000-year tradition that I've just been describing, but also a more sociological approach. On the one hand, Marx implies that science is not affected by its social and historical contexts, not his own science at least. The inexorable advance of science in natural science too, in the famous 1859 preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy by Marx, the advance of science is congealed in the onward march of the forces of production, and thereby undergirds the epical rise and fall of modes of production. It's ultimately a technological determinism, but it's more than that. It's a vision of science itself as progressing in a kind of a steady, natural way, except when it's fettered by bad forces of production, which are then burst asunder and allow a new move forward. Yet Marx also suggests, and this is for me more interesting, a number of ways in which science is actually socially determined. First, science is shaped by material social relations, just as a general claim about reality, the ideal is, quote, nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man and translated into forms of thought. That's a quote from Capital. Second, capitalism stimulates technological advance and thereby promotes scientific change, above and beyond any putative human baseline orientation toward material improvement or scientific improvement. Third, Marx's theory of history suggests that social structures, as I just alluded to, do fetter or prevent at certain moments in time the development of science. What about the social sciences? In the 1844 manuscripts, Marx predicted that the natural and human sciences would eventually be unified. However, this naturalism is contradicted everywhere in Marx's work, allowing him to be used by both scientific positivists and anti-positivists in this field alike. Marx and Engels' writing can be mined for a rudimentary sociology of social science or social knowledge. First, according to Marx and Engels, the history of idea is rooted in modes of production and in the real activities and material conditions under which people live. If scientific ideas are exempted from this determination, this would need to be somehow explained, and it's not clear how that would happen. This is more of a logical deduction from that claim, but still. A second set of ideas involves the role of intellectuals in Marx. In general, intellectuals belong to the ruling class. They are its thinkers, its, quote, active, conceptive ideologists who make the perfecting of the illusion of the class about itself their chief source of livelihood, end quote. And this applies to scholars, scientists, and academics as well. The historians, he says in each epoch, share the illusion of that epoch. The discussion of socialist theory in Marx makes it clear that ideas may relate to different aspects of social theory. On the one hand, most of the writing by historians is explained as a function of their class background and class relations. But socialist theory itself, Marx and Engels' own work, is a reflex, quote, in thought, of the fundamental conflict between productive forces and modes of production. So this one body of work is exempted from that same determination. Or it's subjected to a different kind of determination, more precisely. Socialist theory may escape from one form of determination, but it exemplifies that other form. It reflects in thought the fundamental conflict between forces and relations of production, but it doesn't reflect in thought the elite class position of the intellectuals somehow. Socialist theory is unique. Accurate, non-ideological social knowledge is possible, this suggests, under certain social conditions. But they are not convincingly spelled out in Marx. Marxists such as Georg Lukács picked up this problem later, and it was given a new twist by those theorists in point 7 here, some of whom, like Sandra Harding, explicitly acknowledged their debt to Lukács. Somewhat more compellingly, Marx and Engels suggested various ways in which philosophy is shaped by aspects of reality, social reality, but without necessarily becoming more true as a result. So the point about socialist theory is it somehow also is becoming more true as a result. Philosophy, he argues, or they argue in various parts of their work, can register emerging contradictions between social relations and modes of production, and forces of production, excuse me. Philosophy may take an anticipatory form when the social relations inside one nation come into contradiction with the social relations and practices of another nation or other nations. The international migration of ideas, they suggest at one point, can lead to disjunctures between conditions that are local and theory itself. The famous example here is Germany, where philosophical ideas can compensate for social relations. Philosophical ideas like Marxism or others may be out of sync with local relations. In Germany, they write, quote, mental developments like young Hegelianism serve as a substitute for the lack of historical development. So this is a whole laundry list of different ways. What I find that these all have in common is all of them show some décalage, some split between the social conditions in the nation state itself or in the class structure within which they live and the ideas. Now, all good and right-thinking social scientists nowadays tend to reject Marxism as reductionist, for tying culture, politics, and science too closely to capitalism or modes of production. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up, actually. But by consistently arguing that social thought is shaped by social determination, that modern social science evolves in an international as well as a national and local arena, and that it may be compensatory, anticipatory, legitimating. At the very least, Marx stimulated thinking about where the sociology of knowledge would have to do more work. And even non-Marxist creators of the sociology of science and knowledge, such as Mannheim, trace their intellectual lineage back to Marx. As the American sociologist of knowledge Robert K. Merton wrote in 1949, Marxism is the storm center of Wissenssoziologie. So in the beginning of the Cold War, he's still acknowledging the importance of Marxism to his own work. Merton was, of course, most deeply influenced by the Soviet historian Boris Hessen, but I'll get to that in a moment. Interlude, then. Ernst Mach, Paul Tannery, and George Sarton. These are three names that aren't that familiar nowadays outside of certain specialized fields, but they're interesting as transition figures between progressive historians of science and the 20th century contextualizing approaches to the history of science. In contrast to Enlightenment thinkers, Mach believed that the study of the, quote, rejected and transient thoughts of scientists could be very important and very instructive as they bring new possibilities before us, showing that what exists to be in great measure is conventional and accidental. Tannery, the French mathematician, established the vision of a general history of science that would not merely be the separate histories of particular sciences, but a history of scientific thought in the context of society and ideas. And then Sarton, finally, the Belgian-born, American-based founder of the journal ISIS, which is still the leading journal in the history of science, played a key role in establishing the discipline in the 20th century. And his own approach, although it was mainly still internalist and progressivist, science goes progressively forward, and the causes are those internal to science. Sarton did mention a few economic and social factors occasionally that played a role. Okay, so let me move on to the fourth and fifth transitions or ruptures. And this is the movement from the sociology of knowledge to the sociology of science. The 19th century was not only the age of science, but also, as many of you know, I'm sure all of you know, gave rise to the beginnings of a real critique of science, especially in Central Europe. German idealism and romanticism gave rise to a whole array of philosophies that were skeptical of universalism, rationalism, the Enlightenment, and the idea of progress. Even if historicism as a word didn't exist yet, these components that later in the 20th century came to be seen as constituting an important part of the German historicist tradition arose in various writings and came to eventually congeal in the Weimar Republic in the discussion of historicism as a kind of a coherent critique of science. This critical skepticism reached a crescendo in the years before and after World War I. Dilthey, Windelband, and Rickert in Germany produced rigorous philosophical critiques of the naturalist effort to configure the emerging human sciences along the lines of the natural sciences. Trilch, the sociologist and theorist of religion, historian of religion, lamented the destruction of the great metaphysical and religious systems by science. Gaston Bachelard wrote in 1938 from France that in Europe there's an overall, quote, devalorization of the objective and rational life that declares science to be bankrupt. German sociology, the discipline in which contextualizing approaches to knowledge were most powerfully expressed in this period, understood itself, as various historians of German sociology have pointed out, as a Krisenwissenschaft, a science of crisis, both because of the causal nexus in which it emerged, a crisis nexus, but also in terms of its interest in crisis per se as a kind of a topic and a kind of almost a weirdly flourishing condition for some kinds of thought. It connected sometimes its own insights to this very context of crisis, which in other ways was terrifying. The sociology of knowledge emerged formally in the writing of Max Scheler and Karl Mannheim. Max Scheler presented himself, of course, as an anti-Marxist, and this is one of the ways in which the legacy of Marxism politically becomes anti-Marxist, but still draws heavily on the ideas of Marxism. Bukharin himself noted that Scheler borrowed a number of his basic principles from Marxism. Scheler, for example, indicates that the different types of knowledge, including some quite formal systems of thought and valuation, are bound up with particular social groups, including social classes. Perhaps most interesting in the present context is his theory of modern science itself, which he argues emerged from the combination of, quote, two classes that were involved in, that were originally quite separate. A group of, on the one hand, educated upper classes who were involved in free contemplation, and another group of people who have rationally accumulated the experience of craftsmanship and work. Obviously, these two classes were separate through the modern era, but Scheler's thesis about the origins of science was that these two groups coming together was a crucial factor in the rise of modern science. This thesis about the origins of science was repeated by a number of Marxist and non-Marxist figures, including Edgar Zilsel himself. This is actually known nowadays as the Zilsel thesis, but it was originally, I think, as far as I can tell, articulated by Scheler before Zilsel. Karl Mannheim was the more influential sociologist of knowledge. Mannheim defined the sociology of knowledge as taking on both the form and the content of the history of its object. And that's a crucial move to not only take on the form, but the content, especially when we look forward to the post-World War II American sociology of science, which was very, very focused on formal features and institutional features and was unwilling to tackle the ideas themselves as if they were socially determined. Mannheim thought the goal was to trace the connections between, quote, the social position of given groups and their manner of interpreting the world. He credited Marx with unmasking, his famous word, the class interest behind ideologies, and Nietzsche for ascribing certain modes of thought to aristocratic and democratic cultures and analyzing certain ideas as instruments of a will to power. Another key influence on Mannheim was the Budapest Sunday Circle in 1916 through 19, known also as the Lukács Group. Mannheim was part of that group. He went beyond Lukács, his early, you could say, both friend and mentor in some ways, or he was at least influenced by him, in attending to the role of a number of things that Marxists conventionally had not been interested in. Generations, age generations, status groups. Weber was interested in those, but in addition to classes, Stände, in addition to Klassen, sects, occupational groups, schools, entire socioeconomic modes of regulation. He talks about, in his post-war work, he talks about planning and the impact of planning on the social sciences, or the interrelations between the new macroeconomic planning and social science. And so it went beyond Marxism in terms of broadening out the causal structures or causal mechanisms, if you want to put it that way, shaping science. One of the puzzles, or one of the delicate points in the reading of Mannheim, as I see it, as a newcomer to this Mannheim literature, is his sociology is the place of the natural sciences in his sociology of science. Robert K. Merton insisted that Mannheim, quote, neglected the analysis of more firmly established disciplines and exempted the exact sciences altogether, that he exempted them from existential determination, as he put it, from determination by social factors. Now, this criticism, I think, is misleading as I read it. Mannheim is, I think, conflating the philosophy of science, which distinguishes, most of it distinguishes between better and worse scientific practices, and the sociology of science, which seeks to explain how existing science comes into existence, rather than recommending how to conduct science or how good science is done. And Mannheim hews close to the traditions of Rickert and Max Weber and the entire Southwest German neo-Kantian school of philosophy, Windelband and Lask, in distinguishing epistemologically between the natural and the human sciences. That was a part of the tradition that Mannheim takes on board, that they are not to be conflated. He doesn't adopt the terms which by then had been superseded of ideographic and nomothetic science or of Geisteswissenschaften and Naturwissenschaften, but he does think that they're different. But nowhere does Mannheim come right out and explicitly argue that the natural sciences or the exact sciences are immune from social determination. I think these are separate issues, and Merton conflates them. It's unclear why he conflated them. He may have either not realized that he was conflating them. This may have been a function of the kind of logical positivism that he was being exposed to on a weekly basis at the Columbia Sociology seminars with Robert Nagel. And I'm not sure, but anyway, that's what happened. Moreover, Mannheim pointed to the ways in which social science was entangled with the social forms that it analyzed. And I think this is one of the really exciting things about the history of social science, is when it can show, as I tried to argue on Wednesday, or on Tuesday, I mean, that, it seems like I've been here for quite a long time, but that actually the social sciences shape the world. They're not only shaped by the world they're in, but they can sometimes shape it, both intentionally and unintentionally. And in Man and Society in an Age of Reconstruction, his post-war book, he analyzed the ways that pragmatism, behaviorism, and official forms of psychoanalysis were developed to influence social behavior within contemporary, nowadays we might say Fordist regimes of regulation, anticipating also Foucault's critique of those forms of what Foucault called discipline and governmentality. The interwar period also saw the first efforts to explain the exact sciences sociologically. And as far as I can tell, the initial efforts came from the Soviet Union, which was the first country to create an institute for the study of the history of science and technology. In 1930, Bukharin became head of that institute, and in 1931, he headed the Soviet delegation to the Second International Congress of the History of Science and Technology in London. And this apparently in the history of the sciences, I've read all I can on this. This is a super important and interesting meeting. And Bukharin argued there that both the science, the natural and the social sciences are, quote, heavily mediated by social, economic, and political factors, and that epistemological Robinson Crusoes are just as much out of place as Robinson Crusoes were in the atomistic social science of the 18th century. This is a reference to Marx's critique of Robinsonides, but he's saying epistemological Robinson Crusoes are equally out of place. A more innovative contribution to the 1931 conference, though, was Boris Hessen's paper called On the Social and Economic Roots of Newton's Principles of Natural Philosophy. This is a foundational paper in the externalist explanation of science. Hessen argued that the main scientific problems that were tackled by physics in Newton's era were determined by the demands of production, warfare, and transportation. Quote, the development of the productive forces set science a series of practical tasks and made an imperative demand for their accomplishment. This does not mean that these demands, however, were translated immediately or directly into science. Instead, theoretical mechanisms were developed by studying practical mechanics. So scientists studied practical technological mechanics. And Hessen argued that, quote, where 17th century scientists could not draw upon an existing technology, in those areas where they couldn't draw on an existing technology, where it was all still theoretical, the corresponding disciplines of physics did not develop. He also examined the effects of social class on science, including the movement of elites into science and the merging of the mechanical and the liberal arts. So again, it's the thesis that we find in Zilsel and Shaler. Hessen argued that only primitive forms of historical materialism would ever insist that economic factors are the only important ones. Also crucial, he thought, were political, juridical, philosophical theories, and religious beliefs, especially in this period. He argued that the class compromise at the time of the Glorious Revolution led Newton to shy away from fully endorsing the mechanization of the world picture that he was involved in doing, leading him to adapt his concept of matter so as to be able to reintroduce or to keep God in the material world. So that's a very interesting essay. A non-Marxist historical sociology of natural science also emerged between the wars. In other places, Zilsel elaborated the Shaler theory, arguing that modern science was born when elite social prejudices against manual labor began to weaken, permitting scholars who were trained to think methodically and rationally to adopt the craftsman's experimental methods and causal patterns of thought, leading to a breakthrough in science. And then there was Ludwig Fleck. Fleck was a medical worker and a researcher in Lvov. He published Die Entstehung und Entwicklung einer wissenschaftlichen Tatsache in 1935. And here he focused on internal relations and beliefs, or what he called Denkstile, within scientific communities, or Denkkollektiven. So he coined these terms, Denkstil, Denkkollektiv. This approach made a strong impression on Thomas Kuhn, the historian of science, as Kuhn admitted. Fleck's focus was on historically dynamic interactions between an esoteric circle of experts and the exoteric circle of the wider society. He suggested that also, interestingly, that marginal people in diverse thought collectives, people occupying positions in different collectives, so often can create something new out of the clash, and clearly he was thinking about himself in that regard. After 1945, American sociological work on science boomed on the one hand, and institutions like UNESCO became involved in funding it internationally, but it was hobbled by scientism on the one hand and Cold War politics on the other. Merton basically declared that Marxism was off limits now to all historians and sociologists of science for political reasons. He admitted that. Scientism led to a focus in this work on internalist orientation, a substantive focus on scientific organizations, discoveries, technological effectiveness, patterns of citations, patterns of awards, and so on. Merton basically said, this is a quote from Merton, "The connections between science and society have become tarnished because social scientists know that it's close to the heart of Marxist sociology. Science thus continued to be protected from sociological scrutiny by the stain of Marxism." Stephen Shapin, one of the leading historical sociologists of science in the United States, observed that, quote, "Until 1970, it was a truth almost universally acknowledged that there could be no such thing as a sociology of authentic scientific knowledge." Before moving into the 1960s and 70s, I want to briefly review the alternative tradition, alternative only from a US and German-centric standpoint, of science studies that emerged from the French context, and specifically from the French historical school of epistemology that was associated with Bachelard, Poiret, and Canguilhem. This movement was crucial in several ways. Most important for my purposes is that it pushed the history of science beyond the exact sciences to include the human and the social sciences. But there are many other contributions that it made. Bachelard rejected notions of continuous progress or of a singular scientific revolution, arguing that there were multiple scientific revolutions or historical ruptures in scientific evolution. Errors and obstacles, mistakes, now became as important for the history of science as successful discoveries. Bachelard was deeply influenced by Freudian psychoanalysis, and he identified an array of blockages to scientific knowledge that were rooted in unconscious emotions, including scientists' anxieties about social status. According to Bachelard, the scientific fact cannot be accessed from empirical sense data. This is perhaps his most important argument for the Bourdieusian sociological tradition, but it has to be, quote, conquered, constructed, and confirmed via an epistemological break. That's his phrase, not Althusser's. Althusser took it up from him, but it comes from Bachelard, there has to be an epistemological break with spontaneous perceptions and common sense. These ideas were crucial for the anti-empiricist constructivist sociology of science that came to be associated with Bourdieu, but also for the discontinuous history of science associated with Foucault. Bachelard and Canguilhem were also significant insofar as they were interested in the human sciences, rather than avoiding them as non-noble or non-noble disciplines like earlier generations. Psychology was closest to philosophy as a discipline, and both Canguilhem and Foucault analyzed psychology first. They turned to psychology in the 1950s. And this culminated in Foucault's book, Les mots et les choses, I guess in German it's called Die Ordnung der Dinge. By including linguistics and economics in that book alongside biology, this book broadened the history of science to encompass all of the human sciences. The social sciences could now be examined with the same attention to historically changing contexts and contents as the natural sciences. French historical epistemology gave rise to other traditions beside the one represented by Foucault, and that's the approach associated with Bourdieu that I'll talk about in a moment. But let me fill in a few of the other intervening links before moving on to that. The 1960s saw the creation of a series of journals dedicated to social science, at least in English. This started with the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences in 1965, the History of Political Economy in 1969, Anthropology was next, Sociology eventually in the 1970s and 80s finally got into this. Several different approaches to the sociology of science emerged in this period. Each of them was associated with distinct theoretical methodological postures. I won't have any time to get into any of these in detail, but I want to at least mention all of them. In addition to the work by Foucault and his acolytes, there were contextualist approaches to the history of ideas and intellectual history. So this is a huge arena existing alongside the sociology of these ideas. The Cambridge School of Quentin Skinner is one that never has had a real systematic interaction with these others, but nonetheless should. A more influential set of approaches in sociology are those that are variously known as science and technology studies, actor network theory, and the sociology of scientific knowledge. Although I can't go, again, that would take me too far afield here. I want to just say two things about those approaches and how they relate to the ones that I'm moving toward in my own talk. One is they are the main competitor within the sociology of science in the English and French-speaking world to the Bourdieusian approach. This is not only true in France, but I think in the United States, and it is true to some extent across disciplines, although different disciplines tend to align more with one of them than the other. Second, these approaches are typically applied to the natural sciences, and their leading monographs and the examples that are best known from these approaches have been super interesting, but focused on micro studies of laboratories, and for that reason have been less easily applicable to the social sciences, where language plays such an important and central role, as does non-quantifiable practices and fluid processual forms of behavior that arguably are not observable in the same way, and especially where the objects that are being worked on are often social constructs that are not empirically observable. Another key development is the rise of social, scientific, and intellectual reflexivity, my seventh point here, in the second half of the 20th century. I mentioned that this started with Fanon, and I've mentioned the other tendencies and trends that have added to that. And these movements, the only point I want to add to that here is that these movements were also connected to the history of science. And again, more to the natural sciences than to the social sciences, although it seems to me that I may be missing something there, but the best known works are ones that, like in Donna Haraway's book on primatology, that tackle exact sciences or at least biological and natural sciences. The most compelling framework, though, that I've found so far, and again, I'm open-minded about this and I'm willing to argue with anyone, is the one developed by Bourdieu. And in the spirit of my argument so far, I couldn't suggest that this is the end of this history, since I've rejected the idea of a processual approach, progressivist approach, excuse me. And I refer to this formation normally as neo or post-Bourdieusian, so that we don't think that we're doing simply exegesis of the work of Pierre Bourdieu, who's been dead for 20 years now, even though new works still come out, as they do with Foucault, it seems. But someday that will end, and when that ends, we can't just decide, okay, this is the final word. Instead, I think there is a vibrant group of people, a vibrant school of people who are using those ideas and pushing them farther. It's not static and continues to evolve. And I want to provide at least a brief overview of the emergence of some of these types of works. I've listed some of them here in the non-German world, a non-German sociological world, outside of German sociology, that I think are really good examples. And you can see how disparate and diverse they are in terms of their topic. There are dozens of book-length studies, I think, of different social sciences in different times and places that are structured around the basic categories of Bourdieu. What these studies have in common is their use of his theory. They don't have a topic in common. They don't have a historical period in common. They don't have a country in common. Some of them are about the transnational or international circulation of ideas. Some of them are located within a very local space. I want to rather than discussing Bourdieu's theory in general, though, which is another topic, I want to single out the aspects that are relevant specifically to the history of the writing of social science. So first, Bourdieu takes seriously the idea that scientific fields, like all other kinds of fields, and this is one of his core categories, the category of field, may in fact be relatively autonomous from their environment. Sciences, like any other form of practices, may become, in certain times and places, partially bounded, demarcated from their exterior. At the same time, this autonomy generally or always remains partial, and he argues that fields continue to be subjected to and embedded within these environing social spaces and fields. Even once attained, the autonomy can be eroded or erased under certain circumstances. Fields can be destroyed, fields can be heteronymized, they can come under the influence of a neighboring field. So this can happen to any science. A science can lose its autonomy and attain its autonomy. Autonomy can be greater or lesser, depending on the case. Fields are also, and I think this is one of the key distinctions between the Bourdieuian approach and the Luhmannian approach, although I'm by far not an expert in the Luhmannian approach, but I've had some lengthy discussions with Teresa Beck about this while I was here, who's not a Luhmannian either, but it was very, very well embedded in that approach, or very aware of that approach. Sciences, fields, including scientific fields, are typically characterized by unequal distributions of specific power and specific resources to those fields. So actors within fields have differential amounts of specific capital and specific resources that have value only within that field, relevant to that field. And fields are characterized by struggles over those resources. So there's a power dynamic and a conflictuality intrinsic to fields in general. Bourdieu doesn't have a view of humans that says one-sided by any means as, I don't know, Carl Schmitt. It's not that people are evil. It's not that people are inherently conflictual, that they only conflict. There's a lot of libidinal investment. That's the word he used in fields as well. There's a lot of mutual recognition that helps define who belongs to a field and who doesn't. There are those kinds of things as well, but it's a full-fledged world in which there's conflict as well as cooperation. Fields are typically characterized by these unequal distributions, and within scientific fields, these resources are specific to the science in question. Fields are riven by conflicts over science, then, at all times. This stands in contrast, then, to the American sociology of science of the 50s and 60s, which in Merton famously insisted on the existence of a scientific community, that was his term, and to the theory of science developed by Thomas Kuhn, whatever its many other merits, which often emphasized the possibility of paradigmatic science, of a science in which there was more or less complete agreement among all the actors at certain times and places. The Bourdieusian hypothesis, is, at least, will be that even where there are no immediately clear and obvious distinctions, distinctions will be found and they will develop, and they will be the distinctions that begin to structure the differences and the struggles within that field. Bourdieusian studies also pay close attention to cultural works as well as cultural workers. The post-war sociology of science was very focused on counting the number of books and counting the number of citations, on cultural workers and perhaps their class and religious background. Bourdieusian studies, the best ones, are studies that could also be seen as hermeneutic in that respect, or as textual analyses of these texts. And the central concept of his social theory is because the central concept of his theory is practice, studies of science that are inspired by him tend to focus on scientific practices like actor network theory and the STS tradition. So in some ways, I think many of the really positive developments in those STS and actor network theory are completely compatible with this approach, but that it has certain other elements that distinguish it from that. Bourdieu's mature theory and all the studies that he carried out during the last 2 decades of his life, especially those, but also including the book on Heidegger that we mentioned yesterday, the little essay, which was one of the first of this sort, but especially the books that I've mentioned at the very top here, Homo Academicus, Social Theory for his essay in Social Theory for a Changing Society, his self-analysis called Ein soziologischer Selbstversuch, which he published first in German before French. He didn't want it to come out in French until he died because he knew how polemical the response would be in France to it. And Science of Science and Reflexivity, which is his book about science studies. And then finally, as an interesting example of the way he analyzes 2 different fields and their relations to one another, his book-length discussion with the historian Roger Chartier, called The Sociologist and the Historian, but there are many, many others. There's an essay called Science as a Social Field, for example. I think his approach is interesting in his mature approach because, first, it's radically opposed to any ontology of the static reproduction of a social system. It is, I think, completely incorrect to read the mature Bourdieu, and that is the Bourdieu from, say, the 1970 lectures on field theory that he gave, which have now been published in Actes in French and hopefully will come out in the Collège de France lectures that are being transcribed, because he gave a whole year, I think a year's worth of lectures on field theory. That was in the 1970s, and then all of the studies from then on, which really are different, I think, from the studies of the 1960s, which is what people tend to focus on when they argue he's a reproduction theorist, the books like The Inheritors. He shows in all of these books a variety of radical transformations of fields, of dynamic activity within fields, transforming their inner power relations. His book on the rules of art, for example, is, I think, a great example of one that takes the different groups, shoots them into the field of 19th century intellectual field and literary fields in France, and shows how they begin to transform that. And a completely different field emerges, the field of literature, which is relatively autonomous. His book on art, these books the book on Homo academicus, which does this for the educational field and its relation to the field of the state. These are books that show you how temporary reproduction may be accomplished, but are not at all wedded to the idea of reproduction as the natural condition of societies, I think. Just as it's incorrect to conflate the early Marx of the 1844 manuscripts with the mature Marx, I really think that Bourdieu's theory did evolve as well, and the field theory is alive to these changes, including the rise and demise of fields, intersections and resonances among fields. Even the most stable field is a space of constant movement and what he called and sort of miniature revolutions within fields, where different groups jockey for positional power, and that produces at least some sort of turbulence and change. The work of Bourdieu and his colleagues and students after 1970 became also increasingly historical, forging, the French didn't even use the term sociologie historique at the time, historische Soziologie, because it was so associated with Raymond Aron, who Aron, in 1968, became the enemy of Bourdieu after 1968, and so historical sociology came to be seen as politically conservative and aligned with Aronian sociology, which is unfortunate. Now that's no longer the case, and people like Jean-Louis Fabiani and Johann Heilbronn explicitly, and Gisèle Sapiro, and a whole number of others explicitly identify themselves as doing historical sociology. But after 1970, his own work was increasingly historical and forged a kind of an interesting community between historians and sociologists. So if you look at the publications in the journal Actes de la Recherche en Sciences Sociales, you'll see that Bourdieu published many of the leading historians from Germany, from France, really from all over the world, from the United States, everyone from Joan Scott to the German historian Lutz Raphael, who interviewed Bourdieu in a very lengthy and interesting interview that was published about the relations between history and sociology. And many of his students then began to work with primary documents in historical archives. And it's not like there was ever a directive given that they should begin to do this. In the United States, I'll tell you, it's been a real struggle to get historical sociologists to begin working like historians. I work that way, and my students work that way, but there's a strong struggle over whether that's indeed the way that historical sociology should be done, as opposed to relying on secondary sources, as the people did in the 1960s and 70s. The most famous people being people like Theda Skocpol, really Theda Skocpol being the most famous. In the Bourdieusian universe, this seems to have happened because they were interacting on a day-by-day level with historians, and this was the way you did historical work. So I think that's kind of interesting in and of itself. Fields can never be assumed in the Bourdieusian framework to be spatially contiguous with a nation state. There's another, I think, misleading critique that's widespread, that it's a French-specific theory. It only works in France. The bounds of the field are always the French hexagon, and therefore field theory is really not relevant anywhere else. But actually, in the work by Bourdieu and his students, there was increasing study of there was increasing attention to the need to determine the spatial coordinates of fields and to understand the international circulation of ideas, objects, actors, and texts within these spaces. Bourdieu's essay on the international circulation of ideas, and then the work of various students of his after that have shown how important this is. One of the more interesting examples, most recently, is the last one, I think, by Mathieu Hochecorne, which is a study of the French reception of John Rawls's political theory, and showing how the international reception of Rawls, who's politically located on the left in the United States, or at least on the liberal left, undergoes a complete political transformation to the right through the international circulation and the particular actors who who produced that international introduction of his ideas into France, but there are other versions of that as well. Bourdieu's work on the state and his lectures on the state, which have now, his Collège de France lectures, which have now been published in full in English and in French. I don't know if they're out in German yet. Yeah. Okay, so if you read those, you see that, you know, he doesn't take for granted that the nation-state space is the only space for political domination at all. He's very attentive to that. And then the work by his students and others like Franck Poupeau, who's one of the Bourdieusian sociologists in France, has explicitly started to work on imperial spaces. I've worked on imperial fields as well. So, others have done that as well. So there's no assumption that the space in question is a nation state, even though the boundaries of fields sometimes approach those of the state. And a final, and this is also completely relevant for science and social science, as the Oshkorn example, I guess, shows. And a final point goes to the heart of the question of justifications for the history of social science. For Bourdieu, social science requires a particular form of reflexivity. This involves first creating a rupture, as Bachelard had argued you should do, with the spontaneous common sense categories. And in order to do this, Bourdieu argues, the researcher has to objectify the history of the social world and the scientific categories at the specific moment of her own investigation. So there's a self-objectification. It's a completely different form of reflexivity than in the confessional mode of saying, I am speaking as an X. It's precisely the mode of objectification that involves figuring out what the social conditions are that have produced me and my science at that moment. And this kind of reflexivity is the type that Bourdieu tried to give an example of in his book, Ein soziologischer Selbstversuch. In cases like colonial science that I talked about on Tuesday, the researcher should also reconstruct the field of power within which science is being produced. And then the very last point might be to figure out situating oneself within these historical spaces. More important is the relation between the researcher and the historical sociology of the fields in which they find themselves. Reflexivity is particularly crucial in this tradition and takes a, I think, particularly complex and work-intensive form for the historical sociology of social science. Social sciences have to hesitate before blindly adopting the instruments, the theories, and the concepts that they find ready to hand. The ready to hand are the spontaneous ideas, the philosophical ideas that are communicated in one's graduate training or undergraduate training are not the ones that one should necessarily assume are always correct. There's a contingent element to that, and that needs to be investigated. One needs to reflect on what one is doing when one does science. He argues which assumptions one unwillingly enacts, which implicit understandings one may unwittingly reproduce, and more positively, how a more reflexive practice could actually improve social science and, by extension, social life in general, contributing to flourishing within the scientific realm and in the social and civic functioning of the social sciences, and then perhaps by extension, a flourishing or an improvement in their relations to non-scientific practices of the sort that I talked about in the introduction by the Hamburg senator talked about on Tuesday. Such reflexive practice doesn't simply or primarily involve self-analysis or navel-gazing by the researchers, although that may be one small aspect of it. Equally crucial is the historical genealogy of the social sciences themselves. And I think this is one of the reasons why you have gotten this history of social sciences. It's partly because it just became an interesting thing for people to do, but it's also flowing from this ethos of reflexivity. Okay. So how am I doing for time? I'll tie up now. I'll finish up. So in this talk, I emphasize the importance of the history of social science for social scientific reflexivity. And in the spirit of this, I've tried to genealogically reconstruct the scientific space in which current work in American sociology is being carried out. My overarching claim is that the historical sociology is a necessary part of any social science as a form of self-reflection on one's own knowledge practice. But there are additional epistemological, political, and ethical reasons for doing this kind of work. And I want to conclude by mentioning these, a couple of these. The first of these is disciplinary anamnesia, or anamnese. A number of excellent social theories and concepts have been collectively forgotten. And this is due largely to the conflictual dynamics that shape social science, which I've been discussing. Sometimes this is because better theories have triumphed over worse theories, but more often when you do a close analysis of why a given paradigm, like Parsonian structural functionalism or Marxism, as I explained, why did Marxism disappear from the sociology of science? It really didn't have to do with any decisive intellectual defeat of the theory, at that time, at least. Durkheim and Weber were widely dismissed as outmoded after 1945 in France and even in Germany, at least for a few years, respectively, compared to the American-style social science. Again, that's a broad statement. You're writing a whole habilitation on that, so I won't go further. But there were at least tendencies to Americanize sociology, and there were important local actors who were on board with that as well. The archives do demonstrate that at the very least. And the journals and publications show that as well, that some people really wanted to emulate that form. And so a disciplinary amnesia can be confronted with a history of social science in this way. A second justification for this, or this is one of the reasons for doing the history of science, not just because it's a curiosity, but because really some very valuable work has been forgotten. A second justification for this work is that transitions to the present may have been perceived more clearly or in a different light at the onset of historical processes, which are often more open and fluid than once social structures and fields are more configured, more organized and rigidly configured. This is kind of something we were talking about yesterday. The beginning of a social discipline, a social science discipline, often is different from the final, highly institutionally firmed up version of it. And sometimes transitions to the present were perceived more clearly. Observers who have a foot in two different social worlds and worldviews, as opposed to being straightforward card-carrying members of a given discipline, may have been able to perceive these certain nascent social processes more clearly than we are today. Let me give a couple of examples. The societies that were colonized by Europe were completely reconfigured by conquest and imperial rule. Not completely, but dramatically reconfigured. The camps in Algeria that I talked about on Tuesday that were created by the French during the colonial war in Algeria uprooted a quarter of the Muslim population. And those camps are now villages that people live in. The camps are still Algerian towns. So the whole landscape of Algeria was transformed into one in which the prisons became the towns that people, I mean, to be very dramatic about it, that people currently live in. And if you didn't have a social science, a history of social science or a history of colonialism, you wouldn't know that, but we need to go back to the people who were observing that. Or phenomena, some German sociologists have argued that phenomena involved in the development of capitalism, like individualization, secularization, may become more invisible as they become more universal and enter common sense, whereas people who are at the transition between feudalism and capitalism may see them better. Someone like the geographer and geopolitician Ratzel, the German, who when he traveled to the United States, Friedrich Ratzel, I think, he traveled through the United States in the 1870s and he wrote this manuscript about the United States. He was able to see what he described as a society that was already on the way to wreck and ruin. And he described ruins all over the west of the United States and saw that as the future of the United States. That's kind of interesting. This can make these earlier accounts potentially interesting. The third justification for the history of social science is that it could contribute to a better understanding of the conditions for the flourishing of knowledge. Studying periods in which social science and history and other fields are producing innovative new work, maybe we can figure out what the conditions were for that. And finally, the fourth raison d'etre for this field, I've already alluded to, relates to the permeation of reality by social science. The social and human sciences, in some respects, are consubstantial with reality, giving form to such constructions as the economy, the state, and society itself. These sciences influence our social policies, educational systems, foreign affairs, and much else. I don't want to over-exaggerate their importance, but often their presence needs to be ferreted out to be seen. Writing the history of social science may therefore contribute to explaining social processes and events far removed from obvious policy contents. The historical sociology of social science is very poorly anchored in existing scientific disciplines and intellectual communities. It touches on intellectual history, the sociology of ideas and intellectuals, the philosophy of science in the discipline of philosophy, the sociology of knowledge, and subfields like cultural anthropology and cultural sociology, and even on fields like literary criticism. However, I think this interstitial location can also prove to be advantageous, especially in the early stages of creating a new object of study, like we see here. Without a clearly bounded disciplinary field, in Bourdieu's sense, it's more difficult for specific groups to dominate this space. And I think that's why there isn't one particular theoretical approach. The Bourdieusian approach is not dominant, it's just one among several. This is a potentially productive form of semi-marginality, perhaps, to follow Fleck. This may be an ideal situation for formulating a new intellectual agenda. In some respects, and here I'm going out a bit on a limb, but the very irrelevancy of the sociology of social science, at least to the main competing agendas within sociology, allows it to escape notice to some extent and to avoid the pressure to conform to the dangers which, at least in US sociology, constantly hover drone-like above students and faculty in those disciplines, which are the dogmas of presentism, positivism, policy relevance, parsimoniousness, and pragmatism, all of which there's ample evidence of how important they are, such as the study I mentioned the other day, which interviewed the chairs of all the major sociology departments and showed that they try to convince their graduate students to follow these. As the centerpiece of scientific self-reflexivity, the historical sociology of social science can therefore claim to be a necessary part of all social scientific inquiry. Thank you.